Well, good morning. So here's the scenario. There's this person that you've been wanting to invite to church. It's a family member, a neighbor, a coworker, whatever. You've been praying for them. You've been looking for the opportunity. You've been trying to get up the courage and all like that. And finally, you have the opportunity and you're ready to invite them to church, and you do. And they say something like this. They say, I'm fine with all the God stuff. If you want to do that, I don't have anything against God, but I'm just not that interested. I don't really need God. I'm a good person. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have had an interaction with somebody that went somewhere along those lines? Okay, so we can continue on. Good. So we know that that's not true. We know that they need God, and we know all the Christian answers, the things that Christians are supposed to say, or things that Christians we've heard Christians say. We know that we could spend an hour with them, trying to convince them of what a dirty, filthy sinner they are, and we know that diagram where it's sin land is over here and God is over here, and then there's the chasm, and there's the Jesus bridge that goes across, and somehow they have to go across the Jesus bridge. And we kind of know all these things, and they need to be washed in the blood, and we know all that stuff. But at the same time, we know that if we say anything like that, that this person is going to think that it just sounds absolutely ridiculous. We know that. If we actually say this, we know how ridiculous it's going to sound to this person. And it's not that we're ashamed of Christ, and it's not that we're embarrassed by the gospel at all. But we know what it's going to sound like, and let's be honest, deep down, we're a little embarrassed to say it. Who can be honest enough to admit that you feel in those moments, you feel just a little bit embarrassed to say something along those lines? Okay, so it's just me. That's fine, we'll continue on anyway. And the truth is, when you look at that person, they don't have any obvious struggles, and they don't have any overt sins that they seem to be doing. They're not an evil person or anything. They don't have any hang-ups. In fact, they seem like a great person. They're a great dad and a great husband. They have this great family. All their relationships are really healthy and positive. They don't really seem to struggle with a need for meaning or purpose. They seem comfortable with who they are. They seem comfortable in their own skin. They just seem to have it all together. And you kind of look at them and you kind of think, well, they're probably a better person than I am. Maybe they don't need God. Maybe this is the one person in the world that doesn't need God, because I look at them, and for all practical purposes, I can't think of one thing that I could tell this person that they need God for. And so we know that they need God, and we want them to know that they need God, but we're just kind of in that place of I don't know why they need God, and you're just not sure really what to say or where to take it from there. And maybe there's some of you who are sitting in here this morning, and that's you, and your spouse drags you along to church every Sunday, or you come compliantly because you want to be supportive of her or your family or whatever. You're here this morning, and that's you, and you just have this mindset of, if people want to believe in God, that's fine for them, but, I can be a good person without God, and, isn't that good enough? Which is a real good question, because why isn't that good enough? Because, when we read the Bible, there's a whole lot of stuff in there about being a good person, and it seems like God wants us to be good people. And so it seems like if somebody wants to get on board with being a good person and does all the stuff that a good person is supposed to do, and just doesn't want to have the God part involved in it, isn't that the goal anyway? So isn't that good enough? Does God really need us to involve him? Is God out there and he's just oh man, I just feel so sad that you won't praise me and tell me how great I am. I like you being a good person, but I need you to tell me how great I am. Is God needy? Does he need us to be good people and tell him how great he is? Why isn't being a good person just enough? And wouldn't it be great if Jesus were here and we could just ask him questions like that? Wouldn't that be cool? If Jesus were here and we could get one of those really good people and we could be hey, I want you to, I'll give you $20. Go tell Jesus you're good enough. and see what Jesus says to him. Like, how great would that be? Well, here's the good news. That happened 2,000 years ago. That conversation actually went down 2,000 years ago, and it's recorded in the books of Matthew and Mark and Luke. They all write about this exchange where that exact thing happens. And that's what we're going to take a look at this morning in the book of Mark, chapter 10. And if you grab one of those Bibles that's close to you on the chair, we're going to be on page 1144. And it's going to be in Mark chapter 10, verse 17. And so when we come to this part right here, Jesus has been ministering for a couple years now. And he's been teaching this elevated standard for love. He's been teaching the standard of love that nobody had ever heard of or had ever taught up until that point. He was saying things like, you've heard it said to love your neighbor, but I'm telling you, we're going to take it up. I'm telling you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. And you've heard it said, like, if somebody knocks out your tooth and you can knock out theirs, but then it ends there and we're not going to elevate it beyond that. We're not going to cause this thing to get out of control. But I'm telling you, if somebody wrongs you, just let it go. It's better to just let it go than to get revenge. And so Jesus has been teaching this elevated standard of love. And not only that, but he's been demonstrating it. Jesus, over these years, has been living this life of consistent demonstration of love and generosity and humility and gentleness. And not only that, but Jesus has been saying things and claiming things that only God can say and claim. Like he's claimed to be able to forgive people their sins, which is one thing if somebody wrongs you and they do something against you and you forgive them for that sin against you. But if somebody's just out robbing somebody else, it's another thing to go and tell them, I forgive you for that sin. A human being doesn't really have power to do that, but Jesus was claiming that he had authority to do that, so he was claiming things that only God could really claim. And then he was doing miracles to validate these claims to divinity. He was doing miracles that proved that God had the power and the intention to make the world and restore the world to what he originally intended it to be. Through miracles like providing food, he was showing that there was going to be a day that he had the power and the intention to make sure that there was plenty for everyone for eternity. He showed that he had the power and the intention to put an end to natural disasters. He had the power and the intention to put an end to illness and sickness and disease. He had the power and the intention to put an end to death itself. And so he's drawing this huge following. People are eager to see this divine person who's living and teaching this elevated level of love and morality. And one of the guys that comes out to him as Jesus is walking along one day is the guy that we're going to be talking about today. And it says that he's a ruler, that he's a rich young ruler. He was probably on one of the Jewish ruling councils. So this was a guy that from the time that he was a kid, he was raised to be a good Jewish person. He followed all of the commandments of the Old Testament, all 600 plus of them. And it doesn't mean that he was perfect, but when he fell short of the standard, he would follow the commandments of going to the temple and offering the appropriate sacrifice to make restitution to God and do all the things that a good Jew is supposed to do. He lived this tight life within the boundaries and did exactly what a good observant Jew was supposed to do. He would have had the whole Old Testament memorized. This was a guy that you put him in any culture at any time on earth, and he's going to stand head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of being a good person. I mean, he was that guy that if he was your neighbor, you'd be like, Bill is a good dude. He is better than anybody I know, and I need to hang out with Bill more because I need to figure out how to get my life tightened up like Bill has his life tightened, because he's a good dude. That was Bill. His name definitely wasn't Bill. But anyway, Jesus is walking along, and this guy runs up to him, and he falls on his knees in front of Jesus, and he says this in verse 17. He says, "Good teacher, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" And he's kind of saying, I'm a good person. I'm this really good person. I do everything that I'm supposed to do. I just want to make sure that all my I's are dotted and all my T's are crossed. If there's something I'm leaving out, just, Let me know. That might be one or two things that, I don't know about. So just, what am I leaving out? And so Jesus says to him in verse 18, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Jesus is saying, like, isn't it interesting that as good as you are, like as good a person as you are, isn't it interesting that when you see me, you recognize sort of this elevated morality. You kind of recognize in me sort of this divine moral perfection. And Jesus is just kind of saying, like, I just want you to know that you know that. Like, I want you to recognize that you see that in me. And he goes on. He says in verse 19, he's like, come on, man, you know the commandments. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, don't defraud, honor your father and mother. He's like, come on, you're one of the ruler guys. You know these things. And in verse 20, the man said to him, Teacher, I've wholeheartedly obeyed all these laws since my youth. And so the guy's like getting up off his knees and like dusting them off. And he's like, man, I'm glad we got this all straightened out. I knew that I was a good person. And I know that, you're like Jesus and you're doing your whole Jesus thing. And everybody's, following you doing the Jesus thing. But I'm a good person. I knew that I didn't really need that. And I just needed you to kind of like confirm that for me. So like, thanks for your time. Glad we got this all straightened out. And Jesus says, well, hold on just a second. And Jesus looked at him and felt love for him and said, you lack one thing, just one little bitty small thing. Go sell whatever you have and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. But at this statement, the man looked sad and went away sorrowful, for he was very rich. Then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples were astonished at these words. Like the disciples, hear Jesus saying this. They see Jesus, tell this guy to sell everything that he has. And they're like, hold on, Jesus. That seems a little bit harsh. Because you haven't asked anybody else to sell all of their possessions before they follow you. He was a good guy. I was about ready to give up my spot on the team because I think he's better than me. This is a good guy. Are you sure, we can't compromise here? He hasn't gone too far yet. Maybe we could call him back and, just ask him for a down payment or something like that. Do we really need him to sell all of his possessions? This is, a really good guy. I think you're being a little bit harsh today, Jesus. I'm not really sure what you had for breakfast, but this seems a little bit much. And we read this account, and we kind of think the same thing, well, good grief, that seems a little bit harsh. And I wonder, how many of us would have responded to a gospel message that had attached onto it, sell all your possessions and give all the money to the poor? Might have been a little bit more resistant if we were to be so honest. What's going on here? It just seems a little harsh. Let me tell a quick story and then give a different way of looking at this. A couple years ago, one of my buddies, was going in for his annual checkup. This guy takes really good care of himself, works out all the time, eats well, all that kind of stuff. Has to go to an annual checkup for his insurance. And so, he goes in, he's all sure of himself. I take good care of myself. I'm physically fit. I just have to do this as sort of an obligation. So he goes in, the doctor's asks him, he's like, do you smoke? No. Do you drink? No. Do you work out? Yeah, every day, work out every day. Do you eat healthy? Like, yeah, I eat really healthy. So my buddy's like, so I'm good, right? I'm healthy. What more could I do? I am the picture of health. And the doctor says, well, hold on. Let's do some tests, just to make sure. Let's just kind of check things out and make sure you're healthy. So they do some tests, and the doctor comes back and he's like, well, overall, your health looks great. You look really fit. But he's like, yeah, I know. I'm fitter than most people that I hang out with. I stay in good shape. And the doctor's like, well, but there's this one thing. We did a test. You got a problem with your heart. One of the arteries going to your heart is kind of clogged up, and it's going to eventually lead to a blockage and heart failure. We can't just let it go. And my buddy's like, I don't think that's right. I work out all the time. Like, I eat really healthy. Like, I'm in really good shape. I was working out yesterday. There's nothing wrong with my heart. I'm telling you, there's nothing wrong with my heart. And the doctor's like, I'm glad you feel good. But the truth is, there is something wrong with your heart. And you can ignore it, and you can keep working out, and you can keep eating really healthy, but it's not going to fix your heart. And I'd love to tell you that you're fine, and I'd love to send you out of here and say, you're fine, you're good to go, just keep doing what you're doing, you're completely fine. But the truth is, if you don't fix this, it's going to cost you. And as much as I'd like to say, you're good to go, I'm not going to settle for good enough at the cost of your best. I'm going to need you to trust me enough to go into your heart and dig around in there and get it cleared up so you can be your best. My friend went away sad because he had great health. No, I'm just kidding. He had the procedure done and he was fine, like everything was fine. So of course that's what you do. But here's the point, is that I don't think Jesus was being harsh with this guy. I don't think he was beating this guy up. I think Jesus was giving this guy a moral checkup. Here's this guy who comes to Jesus and he's like, I think I'm good enough. I think I'm doing fine. I think everything's okay. And Jesus is like, well, you seem okay, so you can kind of pass the sniff test, but let's do some tests and look a little bit deeper. And Jesus does the ultimate diagnostic. He says, would you be willing to follow me? You recognize me as this elevated standard, this divine standard of goodness and love. And if you're a good person, would you be willing to model that? Would you be willing to follow me and learn from me? The guy says, I don't think I would. And Jesus says, I know you wouldn't. He said, there's something wrong with your heart. He says, why? Why wouldn't you do that? The guy says, well, Jesus, I've seen the way that you teach, and I see the way that you live. And if I lived the way that you taught and did what you did, I know that it would end up risking my wealth. And Jesus says, I know. You have a blockage. You have this heart blockage. You see, you're willing to be good enough, but you won't be good enough that it would ever risk your wealth. Your wealth is always going to be the ceiling to your goodness. You will never be fully healthy. You will only be healthy enough to the point that it doesn't risk your wealth. You will never be able to love another human being or serve or care for or support or encourage another human being beyond the point that it risks your wealth. Jesus says, you got something wrong with your heart. And I'd love to tell you that you're okay, and I'd love to send you off and say, everything's fine, don't worry about it, just keep doing what you're doing. But I know that it would be at the cost of your best. And Jesus says, look, I'm going to need you to trust me. I'm going to need you to trust me enough to give me access to your heart, give me access to your priorities, give me access to your desires, give me access to what you care about. And we need to change some things around. There's some blockage in there that's keeping you from your best, and I need you to give me access to it so we can move that out of there so you can go beyond good enough to your best. So if we ask our question again, why isn't good enough? Jesus says, because it keeps you from your best. And so what does this look like for us? What's it look like for us? If we're having this conversation with somebody else, or if you're sitting here this morning and that's you, like you're good enough, what's this look like for us? Number one, the checkup. And unfortunately, Jesus can't be here for us to say, here's Jesus, would you be willing to follow him? We don't have that luxury. So our diagnostic is to ask two questions. And the first one is, really loud. There we go. Okay. The first question for our diagnostic is to ask, if a good God could exist, would you want him to? If a good God could exist, would you want him to? And the second one is, if he did exist, would you trust him? Now, for somebody, if you're sitting here and you're not into the whole God thing, and you're just a good person, and that seems fine to you, I want you to think about this. I want you to really think about this. If a good God could exist, would you want him to? And when I talk about a good God, I want you to get rid of all the notions that you may have of what you think God is like, or what you think other people think God is like, or maybe what you've been told God is like, or what that your grandma's church told you what God is like, or all those misperceptions that you might have had built up through the years of what you think God is like. And I want you to replace all those for a moment with an image of a God that's completely good. A God that is 100% motivated by love. A God that is completely generous, completely kind, and humble, and loving, and forgiving, and merciful. A God who wants nothing but your very best and highest well-being. And a God who tells you very clearly, with 100% clarity, this is how you can achieve your best. This is how you can achieve your highest well-being. And proves to you, is willing to do whatever it takes to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can trust him completely. That he will never turn against you. That he will never turn his back on you. That he will never use his power against you. A God that is completely forgiving and will never hold your mistakes over your head and beat you up about them. A God that is completely just and will never let evil have the day. A God that will never use his power against his creation. A good God. A good God. Would you want a God like that? If you could go home and pack up your bags and you could move to one of two universes, and one looks just like this one and there is no God, and the other one looks just like this one and there's a good God. And if you had the choice, which one would you pick? Would you choose for a God like that to exist? And I think maybe for some of us, maybe we've never thought about it in those terms before, and now that you are, you think, you know what? I think I would want a God like that to exist. I just don't believe that a God like that does exist. And your barrier is more of an intellectual barrier. You just don't believe it makes sense that a God like that could exist. And if that's you, I want to invite you to the series that's starting next Sunday. Randy's starting a series that's all about how the Christian faith, it makes sense. It makes logical sense. When you get down and you look at the details of it, it's rational, it's reasonable, it's logical. And I'd invite you to come to that series. But I would bet that there are others sitting here, and when you are given the option of whether or not a good God could exist, you wouldn't choose for that God to exist. You wouldn't really want that God to exist. And if he did exist, you really wouldn't trust him. And Jesus says, there's something wrong with your heart. There's something wrong with that. Which gets us to number 2, the diagnosis. We diagnose that by asking the question, why? Why wouldn't you want a good God to exist? I mean, you got to ask yourself, if you're a good person and all you want is just to be a good person and do the right thing, and here's this standard of perfect love, you got to ask yourself, why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want to live in a universe governed by a perfectly loving and perfectly just being? Why wouldn't you want a God who showed you how to love others perfectly? Why wouldn't you want a God that could show you how to be a better husband or a better wife or a better father? Why wouldn't you want a God who had an amazing plan for you and this person that he wants to develop you into. Why wouldn't you want a God like that? What would hold you back from it? And I think for a lot of you who are in that place where you're like, I really wouldn't want a God like that, I think for a lot of you, it's not because you're evil, and it's not because you just have a whole bunch of sins that you've gotten carried away with, and it's not because you enjoy torturing monkeys in your basement in the evenings. Like, I don't think it's any of that. I think it's more along the lines of you're comfortable. Like, you're a good person and you're not hurting anybody, you're not killing anybody, you're not stealing from anybody. You're a good person and you kind of have your way of seeing the world. And you're at peace with it. And you're good with it. You don't really want to go to the trouble of changing it. And you and your family, you kind of have a routine and the kind of pace of life. And you don't really want something moving in that disrupts that because you're not bad people. And you kind of have goals for your life. And you're not greedy and you're not chasing after wealth. And you're not trying to get the best all the time and trample on everybody along the way. You're a good person, but you kind of have things that you want to do in life. And you don't want a God to come in and interfere with that with this elevated standard for love. You just have the status quo. You just don't want it really disrupted. And what's so bad about that? What's so bad about being a good person who doesn't hurt anybody and does as much good as they can, who just doesn't want their life significantly disrupted? Is that so bad? Jesus says, yeah. Because your status quo, your level of comfort is going to be the ceiling that will forever limit your ability to love and care for another human being. You will never love another human being beyond that ceiling. It will be your heart blockage forever, and you will never grow past that. And if that's good enough, you may settle for that. But Jesus says that is not your best. And here's the prognosis. Jesus says, here's what happens. If you just let that go, and if you just ignore it, and you just go on with your life because you're a good person and you're not hurting anybody, here's what's going to happen. Your heart's going to fail. You're going to fail to see the needs and the hurt and the brokenness that God brings right into your life. You won't even see it. And all the needs and the help and the support that God wants you to give the people that he brings into your life, they won't get it. And so the question we have to ask at this point is your why not producing your best? Like that thing that you say, I will be a good person, but I won't go beyond this. I don't want my status quo. I don't want my comfort level significantly disrupted. Is that producing your best? And here's the truth. You can be a good person for the rest of your life and be lying in the hospital bed at the end of your life and look back over your life and not have any big regrets. You never hurt anybody, you never wronged anybody, you never cheated anybody. And you can look at all the good that you did for your family and the people around you because you were good enough. And you won't have regrets. But what if there's something that you don't see at the end of your life? I like to fish, but I'm a terrible, terrible fisherman. In fact, I am more likely to catch a fish by impaling it with my hook on the cast than I am to actually trick it into biting onto my hook. And I've literally done that before. At the end of a day of fishing, I always wish, and I don't know if this is common among fishermen, but this is how I am. At the end of a day of fishing, I would love to just kind of look out on the stream and be like, God, show me where the fish were. Just have God illuminate where they were, just so for my knowledge, just to know, was I even in the ballpark? Was I even fishing where there were fish? I just would be curious. And I would just love to have that power. God, illuminate. Where were they? Oh, I had no clue. You know, it would be interesting to me. What if at the end of our life, we could ask God to illuminate? Where was the need, God, that I missed? Where was the hurt? Where was the brokenness that you were bringing into my life? And what if God started lighting up all these people that had crossed your path? And some of them you could say, yeah, I helped that person. Yeah, that person, yeah, I made a difference in their life. But what if there were all these people and random encounters and coworkers and family members and neighbors that you didn't even know, but that God had brought about across your path because his intention was that you would be the light in their lives, that you would be the lifeline for them, and you missed it. Would you even want to know? And I wonder if we continue on with the status quo, saying, I'm just good enough, you may never know how much you miss. Here's the other question. Is your why not, is it producing the world's best? That thing that you will not break through, that thing that you will not remove, that ceiling to your love, is it producing the world's best? And I know you're thinking, I'm not going to be a world changer. I'm not going to go out and solve world hunger. For me, it would be like I'm not that smart. I'm just not that talented. I'm not that bright. For you, you might have other reasons. But, you just have this sense like, I'm not going to go out and change. What am I really depriving the world of? In 1991, a little girl, 11 years old, let me find her name. 11-year-old girl named J.C. Duggard. In 1991 was on her way to school, walking to the bus stop. And a man named Philip Garrido picked her up, stranger to her, kidnaps her, takes her back to his home, chains her to a bed in the shed behind his house, and then rapes her, beats her, day after day, for 18 years. This girl lives chained in a shed behind his house, gives birth to 2 of his kids. For 18 years. And when this came to light, there was obviously a lot of talk about what are we going to do about evil people like that. Because this guy had committed similar things in the past, and there was a lot of discussion about how do we keep lists of these people, and how do we keep track of these people, and how do we check up on these people, and it was all appropriate. But here's what they didn't talk about. What they didn't talk about were the neighbors. What they didn't talk about were the neighbors who over the course of 18 years made calls to the police because they thought there were children being kept in a shed in the backyard of their neighbor's house. 18 years. And these were good people. The neighbors were good people. And they didn't hurt anybody. And the neighbors never murdered anybody. And they never locked anybody up in a shed. They were just good people. But they were too busy. They were too comfortable. They were too focused on their happy lives and being good people and having good families and doing good things and not hurting anybody, that even though they recognized something was wrong, they never did anything. Nothing. For 18 years. And the reason that evil like that can exist in our world, the reason those atrocities can happen in our world, is partly because there are evil people willing to commit those atrocities. And yes, we should be concerned about evil people like that. But the other part of the equation, the other reason that those things can happen in our world is because our world is filled with good people who don't hurt anybody and just mind their own business and don't worry about what their neighbor's doing. I'm just going to be a good person. And they miss it. They miss the need. And they miss the brokenness. And as concerned as I think we need to be about the atrocities of evil people, I think we need to be even more concerned about the indifference of good people. Good people. Number 4, the cure. Jesus says, you might be satisfied with a world that runs on good enough, but I'm not. Because Jesus has a vision for a completely different kind of world, a world we can barely imagine. Jesus has a vision for a world where that kind of abuse is impossible. A world where it would be impossible for a child to be abducted. A world where it would be impossible for someone to be abused like that. A world where it would be impossible for the kinds of things that we hear in the news day in and day out about hurt and pain and abuse. It would be impossible. A world where it would be impossible to leave your house and feel unsafe. Where it would be impossible to walk down the street and not feel loved and wanted and desirable. Jesus has a vision for a world where it would be impossible for evil to exist. His vision for that world works only when the people in that world are willing to rise above and move aside whatever comfortable lifestyles they've gotten accustomed to and trust and follow and adhere to a higher standard of love. Jesus says there's good news. There's good news. We can fix this. We can fix this. This can be treated. He says, but I'm going to need access to your heart. I'm going to need you to trust me. I'm going to need you to trust me to go into your heart and kind of move some things around and change some priorities around and take that lifestyle and take that comfort and take that status quo. And we're going to have to deprioritize that a number of notches, and we're going to have to elevate the importance of love and care and concern and healing for other people to the point that there is no barrier to how you love somebody else. And there is no ceiling to the care and support that you can give another human being. Jesus says, here's my question. Are you willing to settle for good enough? Are you willing to settle for a good enough world? Because I'm not. I'm not. I love you too much to settle for good enough. So there's Jesus talking to this rich young ruler. And he tells him, look, you got to get rid of this. It's going to hold you back from your best. And the guy says, I can't do it. Here's Jesus, the Creator, looking in the eyes of his own creation. Look into the eyes of his child. It says that he loves him. He loves him. And he sees right down into the depths of his soul and into his heart. And he sees the hold that wealth has on him. And it breaks Jesus' heart. And as he walks away with tears in his eyes, Jesus says how hard it is for the rich. Man, what a hold wealth has on them. And it's destroying their souls. And it's destroying the world. And for those of us who are here this morning who've just never been that interested in God, we're good with the status quo. We're good people. Your Creator looks into the depths of your soul and says, how hard it is for a comfortable person to enter the kingdom of heaven. What a hold that comfort has. What a hold the status quo has on you. And it breaks his heart to see you miss out on your best. And he'll let you walk away. He won't force himself on you. He won't coerce you. He won't manipulate you. He won't scare you into aligning your life with him. He's too good for that. He loves you too much for that. But he invites you into something better. And for some of you guys here, this whole thing has been about that person that you know, that coworker, that family member, that neighbor. And you need to have that kind of conversation with them at the appropriate time. You need to find a way to make the space for it, to sit them down and say, no, if a good God could exist, would you want him to? Would you trust him if they did? And if not, why not? And is that producing your best? Is it producing the world's best? And are you willing to settle for anything less than the best? And for some of you, you're a follower of Christ, and you have been for a long time, but you've kind of drifted a little bit. You've kind of settled into just being a good person, and Christ has lost command of your life. You've kind of just slowly drifted away over time because you're a good person, and nothing's really wrong. You can't hear the Master's voice anymore. And it's time for you to draw back in. Say, you know what? What blockages have I allowed to start to build up in my life? And maybe you're that person who you've said all along, I'm a good person. I don't see any need for God. Maybe today's the day that you really start reflecting and thinking deeply about whether or not there's something wrong with your heart. And what's keeping you from your best? Is it worth it? Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much that you are a good God. That you're a God who wants nothing but our very best and our highest. And you will stop at nothing to get it. And even though we might become satisfied with good enough, you never are. Because you see what's possible. And your heart breaks until it's fully realized. Father, I pray so much for our hearts today that you would open us up to a new vision of what's possible. That you would draw us near to you. That we would get that clarity on ourselves and on reality. That maybe today would be the day that we make that decision to trust you, follow you fully. Lord, I ask for your Spirit's guidance and instruction in our hearts and our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.